Hello and welcome to the second of our videos here where we go start to finish on a miniature, somewhat sped up of course, and here you can see that I'm just putting down a little bit of zenithal highlighting, or dusting as Wayne likes to call it. So I did some somber grey from 45 degrees, and then from above and just sort of a little bit of an angle, not much at all, we've got some white ink going over. So if you've not watched the first one of these, I hasten to add, this is not a tutorial, but you can look and see if you like some of the techniques that I use and then use those yourself. So please do watch it and take from it what you will, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. So here we are, we have Meriadoc Brandybuck, we have Mary, and this is part of our ongoing project to play through the entire Quest of the Ringbearer book, and we're going to build and paint the miniatures and the scenery and show you all of this process. And whether you're watching it right now or you come back to it later and watch it all through, then I hope that you'll find it worthwhile. Now this particular, I've got some new paints here, so I was trying out a few different colours. So the yellow waistcoat seemed a perfect opportunity to start them, and this is a new tube of paint, of the scale 75 paint, and I've had this with one of them before where the gel medium that they use seems to just overtake it a little bit, and I'm hoping it's just the top of this tube, because the other tube I had was a grey, a blue grey, and it's never quite, I've never been able to get a decent sort of coverage with it. It seems more gel than actual paint and pigment in there. But so it took me about 3 or 4 different layers there, and then this lighter yellow here I'm just mixing in just to create a bit of a better highlight. So it's a layer on the highlight, so I'm just going to pretty much colour in all of what I've just done, and it is like colouring in. Then do the buttons there, but leave the recesses, so you can see I'm leaving the darker sections. So pretty much all of it, about 90% of it, 95% of it will be covered with this, and eventually I go back in with the colour I just had and try and get that little bit of grey that sort of pokes through. But using the zenithal highlighting, it helps with this yellow. As long as you can get a big enough brightness of it, then it doesn't matter so much if you leave the sort of shadows and things from below, and that's exactly what it's there for. So it helps us with some of our colours, and it'll really help us with the blue of the coat, the green of the coat a little bit later. So fairly simple process on this, but what I'm not doing is using a wash to knock back this colour, because I think that will lose that brightness, because it's quite a desaturated yellow by the time I've finished. By the time I've finished this using the pale sand, which comes in a moment, or is it now? Then if we knock that back with a wash at any stage, then it's going to dull it down, and we want it to be the bright element of this particular miniature, because as I've said before, the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit type stuff can be quite sort of dark, and if there's ever an opportunity to make things brighter, it's on a Hobbit. So Mary is now getting a little bit of white with that pale sand, and just sort of brightest elements there. And then we're not going to play around with this too much, and you can see what I tend to do is work from the inside out. So I've gone for the thing that's furthest inside, which is that waistcoat, and then I'm going to move onto the trousers, which are again underneath the coat. So it's good to get those done, and then so you're not trying to fiddle inside stuff whilst and getting the paint all over the stuff that you've already done if you've done the outside parts first. So work from inside to outside is the way I usually work, and you'll see that classic in action a bit later when I splodge green all over those trousers I've just done, because I'm trying to get it between his legs there. So then we're on to the contrast paints here, and this is where the zenithal highlight underneath is brilliant. It works brilliantly with the contrast paints, and it really does sort of add to the contrast and develop what the contrast is trying to do naturally. And then just a simple highlight over the top of that later will finish that off completely. Now this is one of my favourite colours of any of the colours I have, and it's an airbrush paint. So it's Game Air paint, and I use a lot of airbrush paints with the brush. And this is Dark Green by Vallejo Game Air, and it acts almost like those contrast paints. If you layer it on nice and thickly, you get the shadows. We've already got a bit from the zenithal highlighting we did before, but we get even more. It sort of sits, but with a nice pigment in the sort of crevices of the coats there, and gives a really nice, you could just leave that and it'd look great. I do add a little bit of extra highlight in a moment, but you could just leave that completely. So I'm not going to completely leave it. I will add a little bit of highlighting. And as you can see, this is a really teeny tiny model. I can't express how small these things are for 28mm models. So actually I'm trying to get really close to the camera, but it does mean that occasionally I disappear off above the camera. So trying to get it so that you can see nice and close, and I've got it fairly zoomed in. So a little bit of pale green here, and this is Model Air. And this is the sort of paints I have around. There's lots of greens I use on this model, and a lot of these greens are the ones I'd use for sort of Second World War type painting, and quite useful in this respect, where there's lots of cloaks and things in Lord of the Rings and in Middle-earth. And so I've mixed this in with the dark green and just putting a first highlight on, and then I'll do a very quick second highlight just with the pale green. So straight into the pale green there and over the top. I'm working quite quickly. Made sure that the base coat was dried, but then if a little bit of wet in wet works okay here. One of the mistakes I quite often make is I go back and I don't dry things properly with the technique I use, and then I lift paint off, and you'll see that a bit later when I do the sword, where I'm sort of I get a bit too keen, a bit too excited, and go in there quicker. So here you go. Here's some of our Second World War stuff with our NATO green here, and I'm going for. So what I'm going for is a different shade of green, but I will tie it in together and tie it across the model by using a similar highlight. So I'll use the same highlight colour with the pale green. So here I am going to go completely across the whole of this cloak, and because I'm using an air colour here, so this is a Model Air colour, you can see that the coverage is not particularly fantastic. So I'm working as quickly as I can across this cloak, because I don't want to be spending ages on it, because I know I'm going to have to do at least probably 3 coats here to get a decent coverage on this, because I don't want this looks too patchy on something like a cloak. If I just leave it and then highlight up from there, it's not where I'm using the zenithal highlighting from underneath. I want a nice solid base coat here to work up from, and this is going to be my deepest shadow. I'm not going to go in and put further shadows in, so it's going to end up being quite a light cloak but quite desaturated. Here's where I get it all over the trousers, so you'll see me go in and just with a wet brush and take that off. And that's another advantage of using the air paints, is they come off really easily when you make a bit of a cock up like that, which I do quite regularly. So here we go, another couple of layers of this going through nice and quickly. And I've just bought Farmer Maggot and his dogs, so Farmer Maggot will be coming up on this series soon, so that we can get the first scenario up and running. We've got a fair few of the models already, and some of them are painted, but most of them we haven't, so it's going to be going through all these different models, getting them painted up, some metal, some plastic, and I'll be working on other things alongside it, so the start to finish will have other things on it as well, not just Middle-earth, and not just from this particular book. So I've got AMR all primed and waiting, ready to go, and that'll be more a case of looking at, especially with the horse, I'll be looking to do base coats with the airbrush. So that'll be something a little bit different, and try to use some different types of technique. These first two I've done been quite similar, and quite effective with cloaks and that sort of thing, where you build up the colour from your first shadow. We're starting to get much better coverage there. We've got nice coverage, and here comes the pale green again. Like I said, if you can link your colours together, so you use the same colours to mix in. It does give a uniformity across the piece and links it together nicely, doesn't make it too harsh. So even if you're using lots of different colours, you can use similar highlight colours and that can tie the piece together much better. And here I am, and if you saw the Boromir video, very similar here. I'm now colouring in again, and I'm painting most of what we just did, but I am leaving a reasonable amount in the recesses so that we can get that dark in the recesses. And this is a mixture of the pale green and the NATO green here. And then I'll gradually lighten this up and go to quite light in the end to get nice big contrast and have quite a light cloak. So most of the cloak is going to be covered with this slightly paler version of this NATO green. And it's just a technique that I don't think is particularly difficult, because you just painting what you've just painted in between the lines and just leaving some. In its simplest terms, it's not very sophisticated, but it brings really, really nice results. And it probably just takes a little bit longer than, say, a classic base coat, wash, highlight. But actually, you're taking that wash stage out, which takes surprisingly longer than you think, and you know, just painting up with more layers. So I don't think I spend an awful lot more time on pieces than I used to, but then perhaps I've got faster because I've painted more and the practice is more. I'm not a particularly fast painter anyway, but I'm a lot faster than I used to be. And that allows me to experiment with more different types of techniques. So you're building this up now, adding more pale green into the mix, and then I've gone right into the pale green there. So into the pale green completely, slightly smaller brush, just at this point, give me a little bit more control. And then after this, I'll probably do one more with a bit of white in that mix, just to get a really sort of final highlight. And I'm just painting in between the areas I just have, and you can start to see the folds of the cloak really starting to come out now. I really enjoy painting cloaks because you get a really nice, it's a really good feeling. You can, and it's something that, especially the GW models, their cloaks are fantastic. Although they do tend to put, so I do quite a lot of AOS, and there are usually the seam of a join right through the middle of the cloak, which can be incredibly frustrating. It takes such a long time to actually get rid of it properly. So I just looked at this, thought, a little bit more contrast. I'll just add a little bit of white into that pale green and just add an extra highlight at the end, just to really bring those folds out. And it will look similar to the coat underneath, but it doesn't look the same. It looks like two separate items because we've used slightly different colours. So I do this, and then I kind of go back here. I think, oh yeah, I'll do some more. Just pick out the tops of those folds, and you can see I'm concentrating lower down on these folds here because that would catch the light, the shoulders, and then lower down because it flares out a little bit, that catch the light. So it's always considering where is going to catch the light. So under the armpit there, I'm not putting anything. So that's the green complete. Now I'm going to make him look like he's been on a sunbed for far too long. So here we go to make the skin look incredibly orange and burnt. So yeah, what I'm doing here, right, I'm just trying something a bit different. So it wasn't really planned, just thought I'll try something a bit different, and went because I thought we'll go for a bit of a ruddy type skin on this particular hobbit. And see what it looks like. So I will then, once I've done a couple of layers of this and got a bit of a solid colour down, we'll look at then highlighting up and then using my favourite Reichland wash over the top of that, just to sort of bring a real sort of depth of colour into it and see how we go. One of the things I do find with this particular model, and perhaps because it's just a bit of an older model, might be just this one and the way it's come out, the face, the features on the face are not particularly don't particularly stand out around the mouth and that sort of area, so I have quite a bit of trouble trying to get the sort of lips right and that sort of thing, because I think I'm a bit spoiled by a lot of GW models in that the faces are so expressive, and just trying to get a bit of an expression on this one is a bit tricky. And even these metal models from this particular era are really high quality. It's probably much better than the fine cast and that sort of thing that came after this. So yeah, it's quite unusual. I was quite surprised, so I had to then work a little bit harder on it. So now I'm going to go in with the basic flesh here, and I'm going to just highlight the main areas. So nose, eyebrows, cheeks, jawbone, that sort of area, and then trying to get those lips, but the lips just don't particularly, they're quite hard to sort out. So I do go back right at the end. You'll see me go back and try and add a little bit of definition. I think that's the word I'm searching for. So not looking quite so sunburnt, but still reasonably sunburnt there. And just going over the feet, not forgetting the feet, of course. Hairy toes. So one of the underrated things on a model is actually picking out the fingers and the knuckles, because it's amazing how they sort of draw the eye almost for such a small feature of any is the hands. And if you can make sure you just get a nice bit of contrast and make sure that you really pick those out, they can make a big difference to a model. Amazing, such a small thing. So now we're going to go all over what I've just done with the Reichland Flesh shade, which will just tie those bits together that we've just done. And then I will go back in with the basic flesh and just re-highlight, and then probably just with a little bit, a final tiny highlight, just with a bit of white added, as it's on my palette already. So then actually I was quite pleased with it, and it doesn't look like it's a really orange skin. It looks like a sort of ruddy skin. The Reichland Flesh shade is fairly orangey, but sort of brings those browns in as well. So actually it gets there's quite a subtle effect on there. As you can see, I'm really struggling with that lower part of the face. So yeah, I do need to add some shadows back in eventually. So yeah, back in and just really concentrating on not highlighting nearly as much as I did when I put the first layer of this in, because I've just taken the Reichland Flesh shade over it. But now picking out a much smaller highlight, and then I'll go for a little teeny tiny highlight just on some of the main places I want to get noticed. So here we go, a little bit of white into that flesh there, and just going to pick out nose, trying to get that lip again. Doesn't help that my brush is sort of separated a little bit there, and then pick out a little bit on the hands and just a couple of the toes, because although the feet might get hidden later by grass and that sort of thing, a little bit poking out with good highlights will look good. So there we are, that's the skin done for the moment. And now we're going to do the hair, and I'm going to use a different type of flesh shade, but it's a really nice brown as well. And you'll see this magically transform in a moment. So I do one layer, and because it's much thinner than the other browns, the Gore Grunter, etc., you need a second layer, but I forgot to turn the camera on for the second layer. So you only get to see me do this once, but I do go over it again. So as I put it down here, just making sure it's well covered, there's plenty of it on there because it goes into all the recesses. Oh, a little bit on the feet, yeah, mustn't forget the hairy feet. Just dab a little bit on there. Not diluting it at all, just using it straight out the pot. And you can see the hair darkens magically. So now I'm going to just put a little bit of highlights on the trousers. So I've dripped some of the Gorgon's fur in there, which is what I use for the trousers. I'm just going to add some white, keep it fairly simple, and actually the Citadel contrast paints are really nice to make mixes with, because you don't end up with a gloopy mess you get because it's quite a liquid paint. So you can make some really nice mixes, and I would recommend using them for mixes, perhaps adding them to other colours to put in what you want, and they can be quite subtle. As you can see, not changing much here, just sort of tidying this up really as much as anything. And then I'll tidy it up first of all, get rid of any sort of coffee staining, that sort of thing, and then I will add some more white and just finish off with a bit more of a highlight, and then that's them done. Not much more to do. So you can see, gone for quite a bit more white in here, and I'm going to pick out the tips of the main folds. Okay, so that's the trousers done, but what you can see me doing now is just take a nice watery mix there and using what we've got on the palette in other areas of the model. And again, this is something that sort of ties the model together again, that the same colours are being used in different areas. So I'm trying to just develop the sort of features on the face by adding a very subtle few shadows back in, trying to sort of create some sort of expression on there rather than just slightly bemused. So I'm using that brown that we've got on the mix there, and then once that is done I will start to work on his sword. So again, got a few new colours, so this is one of them. This is a really nice deep grey. I've been looking for a nice deep grey. You would have thought that would be a really easy colour to find. And yes, Citadel do some, but I'm not a great fan of the Citadel pots, so I tend to look for things out of squeezy bottles, apart from the contrast paints, which I like to use direct from the pots. So this is this lovely grey, and just looking for decent coverage here, so there's 2 or 3 layers that go on here, make sure I've got really good coverage. And this is from scale 75. Disappeared off the top of the screen again. Oh, and just realised. So yeah, making sure I've got a nice solid base coat. So moving into the graphite. So this is very similar to the Boromir sword. Going for a sort of fairly dark metal sword, sort of iron or dark steel dagger, I suppose it is really, or it's a short sword for him. So then a mix of the two. So we've got the Eclipse and the graphite, and then I'm just going to start gradually lifting this colour up higher, but I'm leaving a shadow at the bottom there, so I'm lightening up but not going down to the bottom, and then I'm leaving the tip on the other side, so we'll get a contrast on each side. And then same on the other side, is I've gone up from the bottom there, and then the other side I'll leave the bottom near the hilt. So there you go, and it doesn't look an awful lot different, but just starting to lighten it up now. And then I'll gradually add, it's a better angle, you can start to see it happening there. I'll gradually add more of the graphite into the mix and just edge highlighting the hilt, and you'll notice completely forgetting about the pommel vice cloak, which I remember at the end and then have to go through this all again, but I do very quickly. So just starting to lighten it up now. Try not to have to do loads of glazing. That's always the thing that ends up taking you an awfully long time. So it seems like there's a lot of steps here, but I don't have to sort of go in and glaze again to get this non-metallic metal effect. So it's quite a quick non-metallic effect. You see I went in too quick there? Did you see me lift off the paint? I've got now a blob of dark in the middle of that top there, and I'm just working on it there, and it's really hard to get rid of once you've got it. So I've dabbed it, but it does come back to haunt me again in a little while, and it's just an irritant. Probably no one would notice it on the table. So I've now gone straight into the graphite after having that mix, and then you can see this lightens it up quite a bit, and I water it down a bit and just soften those transitions. And again, just slightly less every time so you get a smoother transition. So you can see I'm only going from halfway up, continuing to bring the edges and the middle line of the sword out by just highlighting those with the edge of the brush. They're quite thick on this model, so it's quite easy to do. Then get a thicker bit of paint, less watered down, and then go even, you know, just below where I started with it last time. And then I can start to introduce a lighter colour. So we bring in a moment the nacre or nacre. This is where I just soften the transition with, put a lot of water in and just soften that transition. That's it, that's all I do. Pull it up, pull it into where the paint is thicker, and it just gives a nice little quick blend. Then I'll bring the nacre in. So I'll make a mix with this. So you do a sort of 50-50 mix before I go into the, otherwise it's just too harsh a transition and you end up then having to glaze it. So more towards the tip and the base, and then making sure that I do the edges, same with the other side. And then we're just going to slowly build up towards complete white. So just solidify what I've just done at the ends there. So again, that creates some transition because you've got where it's slightly thinner paint and then into where you've really thickened it up. I'm still playing with that bit where I rubbed off the paint earlier. So then straight into the lightest grey there, and just doing really sort of just a little bit, so this bit doesn't take long at all, a little bit at the ends, and then we're going to go into the white. You can hopefully start to see a bit of a shine. Of course it's a fake shine, it's not a real shine. Again, keep solidifying those edges. Just sort of helps you to see where you are as much as anything else, because they'll end up being white. And I have actually done one more mix. Probably didn't really need to go as far as doing this, but again, you're just seeing it will create more of a transition there. So then we'll go just up to the final highlights with pure white, just to give. And I do think that if you're doing any non-metallic metal, you do need to, unless it's a very dull one, you do need to go put a little bit of white on that, because that just gives it that little bit of zing. And just be careful you don't overdo it though, just little spots and where the light's hitting it absolutely most. So I'm just doing the very tip, the very base, and then the edges. And that sword is now pretty much complete, and then you'll see me very quickly go in and realise I haven't done the pommel there. So again, I'm going to quickly go in and I'm going to work wet in wet here, so work really quickly into the grey and create a sort of quick transition, and obviously that wet blending will help it to go together. And then I'll just be dotting on the light ones, not even bothering to clean my brush in between, and then all the way up very quickly to a blob of white at the end, and then that just gives a metal pommel there. And here we go with the eyes. So always a nerve-wracking moment on such a tiny model. Just touching the eyes there, and I will work around them with fleshy colour. I'll probably use the brown that's already on the palette. And then I'm going to use I've used a bit of the grey actually, and I've not gone for the white because white's too harsh for eyes. So I used a bit of the very light grey that's on the palette there. And here I'm going to use the brown that's on the palette blob. And this is the absolute classic thing that always kind of happens with eyes, that I'm sure lots of other people do as well, is I decide I'll put a dark blob in it. And okay, fine on there, just teeny, and a blob, yeah, and just make a mess of it, and then I have to tidy it up and try to get a really good point, thinking, oh, the point's not good enough. So by doing that blob, I've given myself more work, and I should have just left it on such a little eye. And then I'll go around it. I then thought, oh, I'll put a white blob in there, and then changed my mind. I just thought, no, I'm just going to make a mess of this. So then I'm going to use some of the brown, sort of watery brown, to go around the eye and just tidy up and make those eyes a little bit smaller. And I would always say do that, because otherwise you end up with big scary eyes. And again, still working on that mouth. And now we're going to start some basing. So just going to clip off the bottom here, because I want the base to have a stone on it and some various bits and bobs, so that I can then place the model on top of it. So just gluing my little stone here to it, which will look like a great big rock next to Mary, and then going to use some of this brown earth texture from Vallejo. Absolutely amazing stuff. Can't recommend this enough. The amount you get in the pot is such good value. There are other things out there that do a similar job, but this just seems to be the best value stuff for me, and it gives it a nice finish, and you can use it for all sorts of stuff. Like, really useful because it's quite fine as well. It's really useful for texturing. Once it's dry, you can do what you like with it. You can paint it a different colour, dry brush it, but it just gives a lovely bit of texture, and goes everything really nicely. Takes quite a while to dry, so make sure it's fully dry. You can help a little bit with a hairdryer, but it doesn't help that much. And then on to realizing I'm using the wrong stuff. So here we go with the right stuff, because I wanted Agrex Earthshade, so it goes in with the rest of my the things I'm using, not Reikland Fleshshade. So yeah, I just go over the top of what I just did there. Not a problem with this shade. They're fairly similar, but not quite the same. Actually, if you've got a sand colour, Reikland Fleshshade makes a really nice sort of deep reddish sand colour. So that's a really nice one to use for that. But this works really well here. And then just going to go around the base with my black. I just use a black primer for this. I think it's a Vallejo primer that I've use, but any black will do. Just something nice and solid, layer it on nice and thick, and all the way around the base. Didn't show this on the last video, it's not hugely exciting, but just shows you the finished, gives a lovely finish to the model. So all the way around. Did say every brush stroke, didn't I? And I wasn't lying. So just finishes that off nicely, and then drop it on its top when you're doing that. It's alright though. And then gluing the model. So I use a gel for my super glue. Although it takes a bit longer to dry, it just is a lot easier to situate. And then once it's dry, use some of these tufts, and we're going to put tufts that look like really long grass all around him. And that's why it's not, you don't want to be spending too long if you're going to use tufts like this around the feet. Don't spend too long on the feet, because as you can see, you don't see much of them. But the bits glimpsing through will look good though. And there we are, our finished model. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, and come back soon, because we'll have more content coming up. See you soon. Bye bye.